Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name is Natalie Newcomb, Program Officer at the Korea Society of New York. It's a great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Dr. Joshua Pilzer. Dr. Pilzer holds a PhD from the University of Chicago and is currently an assistant professor of ethnomusicology at the University of Toronto, where he specializes in Korean and Japanese music and modernity. His interest in the relationships between music, survival, and traumatic experience inspired him to author the newly published book, Hearts of Pine, Songs in the Lives of Three Korean Survivors of the Japanese Comfort Woman. Please help me welcome Dr. Joshua Pilzer.
Well, thank you all for having me. Thanks to the Korea Society, to Natalie Newcomb and Fran Bonham and Daniel and Peter and everyone who's helped out and been so wonderful today, and for all of you for coming. I want to introduce you to basically to three people. This song, it's about song in the lives of three Korean survivors of the Japanese comfort women. But the first thing and the most important thing to me is that we encounter people as people first, right before we start attaching particular experiences to them. And the people who I will be introducing you to throughout this presentation are Pakturi, who you see in this picture right here, and a very close working partner and friend of mine who died in 2006, Mun Pilgi, who also passed away in 2008, and a Bae Chunhui, who you see here standing in the snow, in the South Korean snow. So Bae Chunhui, Mun Pilgi, and see we can go through these again. Pakturi, Mun Pilgi, and Bae Chunhui. And if you have trouble with these names, say you're not a Korean language speaker or whatever else, one thing about this book is that it has one thing that I really like about, books. They have websites these days, and now everybody is all excited about that. That's fine. But for this book, it is kind of important because really the best stuff are the recordings of the women singing, and those recordings are all on this website. What is no? And so you see here that, okay, so this is the homepage of the website, and on the left-hand side, it says about the author, which is not important, about the book, which is marginally important, the pronunciation guide, which I think is really cool. You go here and you press the, can I get the audio on, actually? Anyway, if you want to know how to pronounce people's names, better than I pronounce them and so on, here we go.
Bae Chunhui.
Great, right? And there's also, other keywords that happen throughout the course of the book. So there's Bae Chunhui's name.
Bae Chunhui.
Here's Mun Pilgi's name.
Mun Pilgi. Pakturi.
Right, and while we're talking about the website, the book is with Oxford University Press, and we did it with that press because it's a big press for an academic press, and so they can make a lot of them and make them inexpensive. And we've been relatively successful in that, but one thing that's meant is that all the colors on the pictures on the inside are in black and white. And these women are so aggressively presented as victims in the South Korean public sphere and internationally and so on and so forth, that you almost never see pictures of them in color, right? Because it's too, it's too vital or something. So I really want to have color photographs, and that's why the book is so very colorful. And I'll tell you about that in a second. On the back, there are 5 color pictures of the women, which I think are quite beautiful. And then you have all the pictures that are in black and white inside the book on the website. So please go and look at them in color. The other thing is that the website is free. So all you need to know is the title of the book and my name, and you find it on the Oxford website. And this is free. All the music is free. All the the pronunciation guide is free. So just in case you were wondering, another thing about this book is it has this painting on the front, which is a painting by one of the survivors of Japanese military sexual slavery named Kang Dok-kyung, who I never met because I started working with survivors in 2002, and she passed away in the late 1990s. So I never got a chance to meet her, but this is one of her paintings, and she has some number of hundreds of paintings that are everything from rather explicit depictions of things that happened to her during the Asia-Pacific War to kind of abstract expressionist kinds of paintings as well. And I chose this one for the front of the book because it's I think thought-provoking rather than pedantic or something like that. So now, just in case some of you may not have heard of the Japanese military comfort women, and the Japanese. So I'll just tell you what that was very briefly. The Japanese comfort women was a euphemistic term that was used to refer to a system of military sexual slavery during the Second World War, all throughout the Asian and Pacific theater of the Asia-Pacific War from 1930 to 1945, that was intended as a stopgap measure to keep Japanese soldiers and affiliated personnel from raping local women in various places throughout the Pacific Rim, and also to prevent the spread of venereal disease. Now, and the system involved anywhere between 50 and 200,000. It's very difficult to know with accuracy, but between 50,000 and 200,000 girls and young women who were taken off into the system from anywhere from the age of, the youngest were 11, and the oldest were in their early 20s generally, and the average age is somewhere around 15 or 16. So why were so many, and around 70% it's thought of the women who were taken into the system, that again is difficult to know with clarity, but a tremendous percentage of the people who were involved in this were Korean. And there's a question as to why, and the colonial thinking, the Japanese colonial thinking at the time was that Korean girls and young women were less modern, and most of the women were recruited or kidnapped or obtained in various ways in the countryside. So were more rural, less exposed, less likely to have been involved in modern sex industries, and so therefore more quote-unquote clean, and so that's why Chinese and Japanese and Korean women were so harvested in this kind of this extremely systematic and violent way. So these are some pictures from the early that remain, that give evidence of the comfort women system. Which was a military system. It was created with military by military order, and overseen by the Japanese military. And these pictures are rather famous if you've read books or anything about the comfort women system. You see these kinds of images, and these very images in particular. Here we have I believe it's a Shanghai comfort station with women standing out front here, and then soldiers in a line, waiting to go in. Now, the comfort women system remained a secret for a very, very long time after the war. Basically, although it might be more accurate to call it a kind of public secret, because of geopolitical, international relationships, because of authoritarian South Korea, not being interested in digging up dirt about its own past, about authoritarian collusion, in the Japanese participation in the Japanese military, Korean collaboration with colonialists, and so on. Also because women oftentimes came back and had business relationships or had family relationships that they didn't want to jeopardize by telling everyone about what had happened to them, afraid that they might, for instance, be disowned by or divorced by their husbands, for those women who did get married. And then in the 1990s, the late 1980s and early 1990s, you begin this vigorous protest movement in South Korea with Japanese and Korean activists coming together and feminist activists in particular coming together to expose this system And this is a protest out front of the Japanese embassy in Seoul. So if you, many of you, I'm sure, go to Korea quite often, and if you do, you can go and participate in this protest. It's at the Japanese embassy at noon on Wednesdays. So every Wednesday at noon, the Japanese embassy is right behind the American embassy. If you know, anyway, it's right in the middle of town. It's very easy to find. There are directions. They're sort of covertly stuck in here. I think if you look at the Wednesday protest and then directions, then you look it up. It's in the text, but there are directions. Tells you what subway station to come out of and so on. Some of the women who I've mentioned already are in this photograph. On the very far right-hand side, that's Bae Chunhui wearing the mask, and Mun Pilgi is sitting there holding a soda and yelling, participating in one of the protest chants. And Lee Young-soo, who also shows up in the book, Lee Young-soo shows up in the book. Kim Sun-duk, who's right there, shows up in the middle, shows up in the book. Park Ok-sun, Lee Ok-sun, you can only see Ok-sun's very white hair. In any case, there's a lot of people in this photograph, and the protests just have been going on since 1991, and they've into their, so that means that they've just crossed, in December, they just crossed their 1,000th protest. So it's quite a incredible ongoing protest, and the point is there are a number of things that people are protesting for. One of them is kind of frank and written official apology from the Japanese government. There's ongoing conversations about reparations. There's also, the protest movement is also invested in ending contemporary forms of sexual slavery, which is quite rampant, in our contemporary world, particularly involving women from Eastern Europe and Southeast Asia, and the southern part of the Western Hemisphere. Anyway, you can go and you can participate in this protest. And so the women then became public figures in a way, and these kinds of images began to circulate and became very kind of popular. And when you see these various women in photographs, they're typically doing something like this, or they're crying, or they're emoting in various ways. And when I went to meet them, so. I went as a doctoral student at the University of Chicago, feeling like a kind of weird person to get involved in this project. I was let's see, I've been interested in Korean folk music for around 6 years, and I was casting around for my dissertation subject, and I have always been particularly interested in song genres for whatever reason that elderly women seem to specialize in. And I was looking through a book of testimonies called True Stories of the Korean Comfort Women, which is a remarkable book, edited by a guy named Keith Howard, which is an edited collection of testimonies, and has around 15 women's, or maybe more, women's testimonies. In the English language, there's a lot of books in Korean, which you can also find. That book is called 강제로 끌려간 조선인 위안부들. That's the Korean title, if you're interested. And I noticed all these songs in the course that people were singing in the course of testimony, and I thought that was a very interesting thing. And so I decided that I would go to meet people and see if I could try and figure out why that would be. Why songs were important enough. Sort of the last thing you think about. That people would be singing when they're asked these very serious questions about their past and sexual violence and traumatic experience and so on. It didn't make sense to me at first, and so I spent the last 10 years or so trying to answer the question of why. But maybe, and so I did most of my work at this place called the House of Sharing, or Nanamejip, and there's the website address right there, which is a place around an hour and a half outside of Seoul, in the mountains. Which has a educational center. It has a living quarters where a rotating group of around 8 to 12 women live. This is an older picture, so this is the Saengwagwan, or the residence hall. Whoops, sorry. And then on the left-hand side, you see the museum poking out there, and this shaped roof is the educational building, and a little Buddhist shrine. Here are the fields, which which are no longer there. Many things have changed in this valley as it becomes a suburb of Seoul, really. But in any case, this is the House of Sharing, where 8 to 12 women live, and where I've been going off and on for the past 10 years. Probably counting all my time there is probably around 3 years, I guess, altogether over 10 years. It's this very complicated place, which is constantly being visited by people, by students, people interested in finding out about the past of the comfort women, and so on. And here's Mun Pilgi giving a testimony for one Korean activist over there on the left, and a group of Korean college students, I believe. It's also an intensely so you have all these people coming in and out all the time. It's this intensely mediatized place, so that you have, not only do you have activists and well-wishers and civil society, volunteers coming in and out all the time, who are Korean, Japanese, people from all over the world. So it's a very international space. It's also quite frequent for the women to be interviewed relatively on a daily basis, right, and photographed and turned into various kind of representations of themselves. And this is this is Park Gong-yeon and Park Gok-sun and Mun Pilgi, who's featured in the book, and Kang Il-chul out for a walk, and I call it a walk because they were asked to go on this walk. And then this cameraman and then the TV crew turns this into a kind of representation of the women's everyday life. And this is the women's everyday life, They go for little walks in the field, And none of these women go for walks in the field, unless they're asked to do so by TV crews, right? So it's quite an interesting, and it's winter, so they had pretty much hung up the daily walk. Anyway, we're doing things like walking around inside. But anyway, so you can see what kind of an everyday life this must be, and a very, very complex one. And that is the life that I hope I'm representing in this book. So, and my fieldwork process looked something like this. It doesn't look too. We have these extremely difficult subject to deal with, and I'm this extremely odd person to be doing it in the first place, separated by the women by age and gender and experience of sexual violence and rural and urban, and by all of these different, and culture, of course, and all of these strata. And my Korean, at least at that point, was Pyogi, standard Korean, and now my Korean is definitely not. But at least at the time, we had language markers that separated us as well. And when I went to the House of Sharing for the first time, went to the protest in the House of Sharing for the first time, and I said, I'd really like for you to tell me what your favorite song is, and why you love this song so much, and so on and so forth. The response was really quite warm, So, and the women made such a powerful impression on me, as I hope that they will on you as well. That basically I was just hooked, and whether it was a good idea or not, I ended up writing this dissertation and then turning it into a book over a very long period of time, quite aware of those gaps of experience and trying as hard as possible never to forget about them. The other thing is never to, I think because I was so deeply ignorant about so many things, that put me in a position where I really had to listen, and I just basically had to listen to what people had to say, even oftentimes not asking questions, just waiting and watching television and going for walks together, and really, anyway, listening to people, to the sounds of their voices, to the kinds of performances of themselves that they wanted to show me and that they showed other people, so that kind of perspective, I think, had some small advantage as well. But I think by way of introducing the book, I realized that I have a tendency to ramble on, even though I've just been talking about listening. That's one problem. The other thing is that I also think I probably write better than I speak. So I thought that I would just give you a couple of pages of the beginning and play you the associated music. so you can get a sense of what I was up to. And that seems like that's what the point of this book cafe is. And so let's just do that. So I've never done this before, and it feels kind of awkward. You know, this is my first book and everything, so I apologize for that as well. On a warm moonlit night in the summer of 2005, Mun Pilgi and I are sitting together in the courtyard of the rest home called the House of Sharing. The house lies around 1 hour southeast of Seoul, at the back of a valley that faces the Gyeongangcheon, one of the Han River's many tributaries. From the courtyard, we can see the surrounding rice paddies and fields, the earth-mound tombs dotting the hillside of the valley, and a handful of its many homes. There are some traditional commoners' houses left over from the old village, made from mud and thatch and covered over with blue tin roofs. There are the new suburban houses, a riot of middle-class fantasies, contemporary cottages, slick neo-Victorians, even a log cabin, which are replacing the fields one by one with their own splendors. The frogs that live in the standing water of the remaining rice paddies are not singing, but a common cuckoo echoes ceaselessly down the valley. We are talking about food. Mun Pilgi, who is 80 years old, begins to tell me about things she used to eat when she was little. There were times when I was young, when my family was very poor, you know? We had such a big family, and times were so hard. So there were times we couldn't afford rice or grain. So my father and I went to the mountain, and he cut down a pine tree. And he split it open, and we scraped out the insides, and we mashed them and ate them instead of rice. How did you prepare it, I ask. We'd boil it and eat it just like that. God, how we suffered, she answers, scrunching up her face, but her eyes shine. But you know, it was so delicious. So I think this next part has audio, so I think I'll ask you to turn the audio on again. Kung. We are in her apartment. She is talking about quiet and loneliness and about her radio cassette player. Don't you like the quiet? I ask, stupidly. No, I don't like it. It's that I'm so lonely, so I turn on the TV or turn on the radio. Kung. Because I'm lonely. I turn on the TV or turn on the radio. Kung chak. That's how I live, because I'm lonely. I'm bored, you know? So let me play that for you.
조용한 거 좋아하지 않아요?
좋아해도 안 해. 그런 게네. 테레비 틀어놓고, 라디오 틀어놓고, 쿵.
네.
내가 너무 외로워서
네.
테레비 틀어놓고, 라디오 틀어놓고, 쿵. 그러고 사는 거야. 아니, 외로운 게네. 심심하거든.
Mun Pilgi raps out the basic pulse of a Korean pop ballad, a pongtak ballad, and elaborates it, and thus tells the story of a progression in her everyday life, from a fraught quiet to a space of music. The basic pulse of a song is a song produced by human action, a human ascription of rhythm and order to the sounds of life and the silences in between. It is a time scheme, and may have any number of relations to the world of time-keeping devices that organize social worlds, clocks and abstract time, the relatively even rhythms of walking, work, machines, radio, and television broadcasts. The pulse of song is also often compared to a heartbeat, one of the ways that song and music can remind us of ourselves or others, or of the bonds between us. And I quote, "A song is like a person," Mun Pilgi tells me, "like a friend. She leaves the TV or the radio on when she sleeps. As kung becomes kung chak, a song takes shape. A song from the Korean pop genre turotu. Devotees of the genre use these rhythmic vocables to accompany each other's singing, and these onomatopoeias often feature in song texts as well. Kung chak, ne bakja soge. Some of you might know that one. Devotees of the genre use the... Okay, so I read that already. Which song these vocables will become is as yet undetermined, because we stand on the threshold of song, on the threshold of Mun Pilgi's world of song. It is a world that she has assembled from available cultural objects to suit herself, as a forum in which she can fashion and sustain herself and her social world. In songs, she joins with others. The others in the songs others out there listening and watching by themselves or in groups, and her fellow fans and friends with whom she sings socially. Mun Pilgi and her father had prized sustenance from a pine tree. Now, through an ongoing process of listening, imagining, and singing, she forges a self, friends, and a social world from the noise of her life and the quiet of her room. So Pakturi, Pakturi, 78 years old, is sitting in the living room of the House of Sharing, surrounded by half-liter bottles of beer and friends from across Korea and Japan who have come to visit her and the other women living at the rest home. We are at a song party, a common event at the house and elsewhere throughout the Korean peninsula. Everyone is sitting in a circle and singing in turn. When inspiration strikes, Pakturi doesn't wait her turn, but begins to sing suddenly, as is her custom. She sings her first song of the night in a genre of improvisatory folk singing, borrowing from the Central Korean melodies in her half-sung, half-declaimed, emphatic style. The Paulownia, I really wish I had a slide for this, you'll see why. The Paulownia tree's nuts are bumpy. The young women's milk jugs are plumpy. She explodes with laughter at this somewhat body celebration of the female body in its fullness and fertility. She laughs too at the audaciousness of singing this song before all these people, and most of the Korean speakers laugh as well. The uncomprehending foreign guests laugh despite not knowing the meaning of the words, feeding off her infectious exuberance and joy. A second wave of laughter spreads across the room as interpreters explain the lyrics in Japanese. At Pakturi's side, Kim Sundok, her big sister, at the rest home, Hyungnim, is trying her best through a wry smile to give her a disapproving look. She laughs, stifles her laughter, and then laughs again. Pakturi ignores her big sister's look of mild censure. She has found her space of song, where taboos relax and intimate things are faced frankly. In many other spheres of her life, such directness about sex is not possible. During the Asia-Pacific War, she, like Mun Pilgi, had been made an object for the purposes of sex, but now she deals masterfully with the subject of sex and with the human body. She has made them her own over many decades of struggle and serious play. Pakturi continues, striking a more somber note in the wake of her outrageous first verse. "You're that kind of cruel-hearted man. Getting mixed up with you was my mistake. Things being as they were, I certainly knew you'd throw me away. But knowing or not knowing, I'd have been fooled just the same." Singing this wistful rumination, Pakturi laughs at the cruelty of men and at women's foolishness, with both gravity and a hard-won lightness of heart. The others join in her laughter, some comprehending and commiserating, some just feeding on her energy and her delight. In a sense, laughter and its togetherness are a life raft on a sea of hardship and sorrow. As Pakturi sings, the laughter swells until it becomes a place in which to stand, to live, and to sing again. It's the early summer of 2010, and I'm going back to the House of Sharing after a year. I walk into the living room where Bae Chunhui, having heard of my arrival from the house staff several weeks before, is sitting by herself watching television. She asks a few basic questions about my last year. Then quickly, as is her custom, she shifts the conversation to music. She has been channel surfing and has found among the 50-odd channels a broadcast of a recent soul concert of the Irish and Norwegian new instrumental duo Secret Garden. They are playing Lotus, a piece inspired by East Asian music. Bae Chunhui praises the music and lingers in its swooping glissandos and pentatonic feel, which are references to Chinese music. The melody, she says, raises a scene before her eyes of a distant Asian plain. A distant inner Asian plain. Quote, I can see it like it's right in front of my eyes, she tells me. These remind her of other, much older songs she knows from Japanese-occupied Shanghai and elsewhere that make such references to China. Her ears catch a fragment of melody that reminds her of yet another song. And I quote, this melody, uses a similar scale to that one, Scarborough. She begins talking about Simon and Garfunkel's version of the English ballad Scarborough Fair. She tells me about hearing the song when she saw The Graduate while she was living in Japan, working as a cabaret singer after the war. She begins to sing a Korean version, which the folk duet Toi et Moi, sang on an album in 1970 as Memories of Scarborough, Scarborough et Chuok.
추억 속 스카브로야 난 이제 다시 다시 만나리 내 사랑이 살고 있는 아름다운 나의 고향. 네. 그 이런 것도 기타로 이래 하면 기기. 지금 기타가 있잖아.
있어요.
그런 다음에
있는데 안 가져있어. 이번에 안 가져있어.
그런 다음에 이거.
So we sit together after that, comparing the English and Korean texts. Both, the translation. Scarborough in my treasured memory, when shall I meet you again? The place where my love resides, my beautiful hometown. We sit together comparing the English and Korean texts. Both reminisce about a lost love, but in the Korean version, Scarborough becomes the singer's longed-for hometown, or kohyang, an omnipresent trope of mid-century South Korean popular music. Bae Chunhui turns back to the scene that rises before her eyes as she listens to Lotus, the wide alpine plain, and a bird flies into the picture. She recalls another song, also made world famous by Simon and Garfunkel, which this scene reminds her of, El Condor Pasa, The Condor Passes. The same Korean folk duo had released a Korean version, Like a Flying Bird, 나르는 새처럼, in the years following their memories of Scarborough. But Bae Chunhui sings the song with me in English, although this is not one of the many languages she speaks, Russian, Japanese, Korean, Chinese. In her mind's eye, she tells me, the condor ranges wide, majestic, and free over a high mountain valley. Bae Chunhui also floats through the world, gathering its wonders together in associative chains of song and story. She stores that wonder in her memory, filled with thousands of songs that she had picked up over the course of a life of wandering and hardship. She unpacks these songs when the opportunity arises. Today she has brought out 2 songs to greet me, the returning American. On other occasions I have heard her do this for visitors from across Asia, the Middle East, Africa, Europe, and elsewhere. She encounters the world and answers with song. In so doing, she harmonizes her tastes and experiences with those of others and brings people together in singular combinations. And she extracts from her life experience a soundtrack that demonstrates the promise of the world. I think that's about as good as I can do, for better or worse. So those are the 3 women who I spent most of my time with over this last while, and I think in the interest of us having enough time to discuss, I think I'd like to stop there and say thank you very much, and I welcome your questions, and yeah, please. So thank you very much.
If you have any questions, please come to the microphone.
Hi, I have somewhat of an impish question. Have you been invited by Japanese society to talk about it?
Strangely enough, no, I haven't. But I'm hoping. You know, I mean, one thing that I think music can do here is, you know, this book doesn't come across as being intensely ideological. I wanted to do the sort of historical, you know, introduction here. But if you were to pick up this book, you know, you might, you know, in the course of the first, 20 pages or so, a Japanese, particularly the Japanese right wing, would find themselves coming across songs that they might know, especially if they're from older generations. You know, so I think that I'm hopeful. I haven't been asked yet, but I'm hopeful that music can form a kind of softer, more enticing, and slightly less overdetermined, you know, overburdened with politics. Way of getting people interested in the women, and then in their sort of social and political and personal struggles.
I have also a comment here. I am myself from Poland, and probably Japanese and comfort women were using comfort women in much bigger way, but Germans were doing the same, and there are a number of Polish women who wound up in German comfort stations. So, and then of course, most of you might be aware of the fact that when the Soviet army was freeing Eastern Europe, they were raping everybody, including the Allies' Polish women too. So.
One thing to go along with that also shows up in the book is that Bae Chunhui and Mun Pilgi were both in the Manchuria, and at the end of the war, the Soviet troops came, you know, and to boot the Japanese out, and remained there for a year. And Mun Pilgi was abandoned in the comfort station where she was working, and she escaped from precisely that. She escaped from Soviet troops that had gone into the comfort station with the intention of raping the women there. And then she proceeded to walk from Manchuria to Korea, which is no small. I mean, if you look at a map, they do touch. But she had walked through, you know, for days and days and days through the mountains of northeast, what is now northeast China, and North Korea, to get back to her home in South Korea. So this, there are myriad forms of sexual violence, but they all seem to have some kind of systematic relationship to one another. You know, the comfort women system was designed to stop that kind of thing from happening, but in order to make it, in order to have enough girls and women for the system, pretty much everyone had to be coerced, you know, into it, and to have because of the quote unquote sexual needs of soldiers were conceived of as being, you know, requiring these numbers and requiring that each comfort woman, you know, people were serving between 5 and upwards of 100 people in a single day, and sustaining not only tremendous psychological trauma, but also physical trauma as well. And many people subsequently became infertile, and many people subsequently committed suicide, and so on and so forth. So it's really a very, very dark story. And I was just giving a lecture in a small liberal arts college around here the other day, and I asked if anyone had, you know, it was a group around 15 people, if anyone had heard of the comfort women system, and no one had. So I'm considering that it's sort of like not knowing that there was a Jewish Holocaust or something like that. You know, it's sort of like also many people don't know about the systematic violence, sexual violence against women in the Congo right now. You know, but it's often the sexual violence stuff that gets naturalized, that we don't pay attention to, and that history passes by, because because male power is taken so much for granted. Yeah. That's sort of part of it. Yeah, I mean, I think you learn how to be ashamed, of course. So that's sort of part of how this works. Other questions?
I'm Connie McCree. I actually did some research for a V-Day project, Vagina Monologues, and when we did the comfort women, and so I know some of the women that you presented, and I thank you for the voices. And again, just there hasn't been a time since we have civilization that women have not been used as a tool to subdue people. I mean, you're saying that the Japanese was, yes, maybe to keep them to stop raping, but at the same time, it was saying to Korea, they were tearing apart the families just as they're doing in the Congo today. And so much kudos to the House of Sharing. They mentioned the women in the Congo in one of their last protests, saying that, if we can't get retribution, we want people to be, say that we're standing up for other people. But beyond that, and do you ever have compiled just the singing parts? Because for me, and maybe put it in the disc, because we do the Vagina Monologues every year in a Universalist church, and I would love to somehow get a recording to be able to play that. And if you're considering doing any other speaking, please do, because most people don't really know. When I did the research, we did also not just the Korean, which they did, we did the Philippine women and so forth, but, and I did paintings, but I had nothing from sound, and I really want to thank you for doing that. And so Bae Chunhui's voice is phenomenal. I'm a singer, but her voice is phenomenal for. So would you have anything like that? Would you put anything or consider putting it together in a CD?
Yeah, that's sort of the first thing is that all the online stuff. So that's all there.
Right.
But if you have a particular, the way that I do that, we can talk about this later. Definitely.
Yeah, I don't
But
want to take
no, but so definitely all that stuff is available. The copyright stuff all rests with me and with the women, and so. Every time we've done a number of things like this, and we all, if there's something that somebody's interested in using in some kind of public way, then I go and we have a conversation. We talk about what that will be like, and so it's all based on that. But yeah, in terms of making the women's voices kind of available on the internet, we have this odd kind of balancing act of wanting to respect people's privacy, and so all the stuff that's up here is stuff that we've talked about, and for instance, we go back and listen to stuff, and Bae Chunhui would say, "Oh, my voice didn't sound good that day, so don't use that stuff." We did that kind of thing.
As a singer, I understand, but
right.
But it's an incredible voice, and also because you are pointing out that they are how they have survived, how they live now, and which is so much important for everything that's going on in our world today too. So I hope you consider maybe doing an exhibition type,
We did an exhibition in 2004, I think, in Seoul, and it probably wasn't the right time. It was just, I just found exhibition is just, it's a strange word, and I feel awkward about it. But on the other hand, we have to do these things. We have to we have to engage, and we want to be educational and to share resources and all this different kind of thing. So it's back to that strange balancing act. That was a very frustrating experience for me, because it seemed rather kind of funereal. That it was time to correspond to Liberation Day, Victory over Japan Day, and so it was just an intensely nationalist environment in which that was done. So trying to figure out a way to shift that. As I say, this is all free and up there. And here's my email. Oh no, where's my email address?
I will be getting the book, but it's just.
Oh, but no, but I felt like I had my email address here somewhere. Here, I'll type it up here, and then you can see it. And please contact me if you have any interests like that, and we can talk about that again later, of course. that one is better for, this one is better for all different kinds of languages. So any language you want to write to me and that you think I might understand, you know. Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Very interesting. The picture, the painting, the abstract painting of Kang Dok-yeon.
Kang Dok-yeon, yeah.
It's very interesting because it looks like a mouth, right? Like it's gonna engulf something. But there are a lot of things that we don't know really about, like the spirit of the Korean people, like that hand that nobody can explain or that we don't understand. And you're saying that they were coping with the pain or with the history that they lived through singing. So what was it that they were singing?
Oh, right. Okay. Well, let's yeah, the answer to that question is different, you know, for each person. So that's one thing that's extremely important. Pakturi sang a tremendous number of songs that had this kind of, like the example that I played earlier, that had this sort of sexual content, and where she sort of bossed men around, and that was very much about kind of inverting a relationship of power between men and women for a moment. Mun Pilgi's story is a very complicated story, but to give you some example, she had she has this wonderful song that shows up in the course of the book called Pulyojanan Umnida, which is a faithless child. The faithless child cries, and she always felt she had a very difficult relationship with her family, and in particular felt very deeply that she had hurt her mother by leaving, even though she didn't know where she was going. She was tricked into sexual slavery, but she had this extremely this sense that she had wounded her mother, you know, without meaning to. And this book, this song Pulyojanan Umnida, is the original version of it is about you know, the mother has just died, and the woman it's a we're not sure if it's a man or a woman. The Pulyoja, the faithless child, is pounding the ground and crying and, you know, screaming for the mother to come back and so on, and the mother doesn't come back, and it says, you know, go and be at peace, kind of thing. It's a pop song. And over the years of singing that song, she sang that song for many decades. It's a song from the 1940s, late 1930s, and she sang it all the way through, you know, the early decades of the 21st century. And by the time that she was singing it in the you know, in 2006 or so, all that stuff about the faithless child was gone. It was just, though I cry, you know, though I cry your name, you know, you don't answer, you know, oh mother, where have you gone? And so all this business about blaming oneself for causing the mother pain, you know, all that is slowly disappearing from Mun Pilgi's song. So she's going through this, you know, in that song anyway. I mean, Mun Pilgi is an extremely complex character, and I hope that comes out in the writing. But in that song anyway, there's a kind of cleansing, you know, of kind of working through a relationship and making a kind of a less troubled version of fidelity to one's mother and mourning for one's mother, right? So that's just one example. There's as many examples as there are. There's almost as many examples as there are songs. You know, the kind of inversion that Pakturi was that I was talking about with Bae Chunhui. You know, collating. You know, all of these. You know, she lived in Manchuria. And then she lived in, well, first she was born in Korea, and she grew up speaking Japanese, and then she was in Manchuria, and then she went to Shanghai, and from Shanghai she crossed to Japan, and in Japan she lived there for 30 years, around 20 years or so as a professional singer, and she had all of these really extremely difficult experiences, not just during the war, but afterwards as well. And she collates all of these kind of beautiful things, you know, like picking flowers or something like that, and making a representation of the world, of an improved world, you know. So, and like your comment earlier, each of these is a kind of pathway, to the extent that I've been able to understand it, you know, is for each particular woman a very unique pathway through their own difficulties and a technique of survival and self-sustenance and identity and so on. It's also a kind of, these songs are also documents of that kind of process. And in listening to them, I would hope that they can be roadmaps, through that particular kind of darkness for other people who may need them, and that's another moment where I feel kind of, as somebody who doesn't have firsthand experience of sexual violence, and obviously there's the gender thing as well. It might sound strange for me to say that, but I have a feeling that it's true anyway.
We need men to be feeling this. I'm very grateful that a man is doing this work, because we women have to do the work. But we need you to understand what we go through.
Well, yeah, it's also interesting that in Korea, oftentimes the issue is cast as a Korean problem, and internationally it's usually cast as a gender problem, as a women's human rights issue. And so there's a lot of things that we all sort of need to get together and help each other understand, and this book really for me is just a beginning, and some arenas I've made a little bit of progress, and some I'm exactly where I was when I started, but I think the point is to try. And also the other point I think is that you end up with this huge amount of documentary evidence and also these personal relationships, which are quite transformative, have been extremely transformative for me, and I hope at least useful or enjoyable in some way for the different women in the project, But thank you both for your comments very much. Other questions?
How do they treat the women while they were working? How did Japanese treat the women while they were at the conversation?
Okay, so the question is how the Japanese military treated women who working in the comfort stations. The comfort women system. One thing that's useful about that word system is it expresses the complexity that it had. Oftentimes, if you read historical accounts of the comfort women system, it can sound extremely like basically all the women had the same experience, but the women's experience was extremely diverse. And that's because it was systemically aligned, or arrayed across the whole hierarchy of the Japanese military and its civilian infrastructure as well. So some girls and women were serving common infantry and in many cases were treated extremely cruelly just because of the volume of people who they had to men who they had to be with. Some women were sort of private sexual slaves for officers, and everything in between. And there was also movement, along that hierarchy. So some people, had an extremely bitter and difficult experience, and some people were. Less so, but everyone, the common denominator. There's a lot. There might be quite a number of common denominators, but one of them is this business of being held, and not being free to leave or to go anywhere or to do anything or to have excess information of different kinds, and so on and so forth. And that's why I think it's you notice in the title of the book is here it is, Song in the Lives of Three Korean Survivors of the Japanese Comfort Women. That's the subtitle, and that's a euphemism for sexual slavery. The reason that that's there in the title is that most of the women would rather not be called former sexual slaves, even though they one-to-one generally understand that was the experience that they had. So it's putting that in the title is, and actually the language of the social movement in Korea typically uses this expression as well. The intention is to respect how the women would like to be addressed, and then behind that, we tell the whole story of sexual slavery. Oh, sure. Right. Well, there was a whole regimen of health inspections and health treatment for different kinds of venereal disease, many of which caused infertility later. Many women report becoming very sick and having to serve soldiers anyway. Many women report becoming sick and being sent to a hospital, and in some cases even being sent home. So again, there's a diversity there, and all of these are dreadful experiences, but there is a kind of a continuum of brutality, I think. I saw someone else's hand, right? Yeah.
More of a generalized question, if there's good books in English about Korean music.
Oh, great. Well, a music question. Well, of course, no, I'm just kidding. There's this one. That's a joke. Right. There are a couple, let's see. In terms of a general introduction, there's a place called the National Center for Korean Traditional Performing Arts, the Kungnipgugagwan, and they have a research wing, and they do a lot of publishing, but a lot of that, you're not going to get kind of songs of everyday people. You're going to get established, formalized genres that have been welcomed into the pantheon of national culture, and in many cases have been given special awards, intangible cultural asset status and things like that. And then you have to kind of read around, to look for other things, and there are a number. There's an increasing number. There's a lot of partly due to the kind of resources and money and scholarships and so on that the Korea Foundation and other organizations have thrown behind Korean research about Korea in general, including sort of the arts. There are a very large number of Korean ethnomusicologists out there. Oh, there's a book called Music in Korea, which was published by it's another Oxford University Press book. It's a small textbook, and it looks quite reasonable, and perhaps a little bit off. It'll be a little bit more unconventional than the ones that I was just telling you about. But if you again, we go back to my email address. If you have a particular interest in Korean music and a particular genre, for instance, I'd be happy to help out in any way that I can.
I was very close to my grandma, and my grandma was a little bit older than those women. But I remember that when I was a little kid, my grandma sometimes used to make lyrics by herself to make a song. She used like several rhythms, and she just made the lyrics of the songs. Did any of the women do that there who you met?
Oh yes. Oh yes. This is something that is very amazing about Korean song, and especially about how elderly Korean women treat song. There's more of a tendency among older men to follow the letter of a song and to sing something in a kind of canonical way. And some women are quite intent on doing that as well. Bae Chunhui, the last person who I talked about, was very much by the book because she thought of herself as a professional, quote unquote, and a professional pop singer, and that's what professional popular singers do. But Pakturi was, there's all these different genres for one thing that are about making up your own lyrics to folk songs. Shinsei Taryong, or the kind of ballad of my own life trials or something like that. It can be a spoken genre, but it can also be a song. And Pakturi made up many of these. There are also people who, and it's quite common to do Shinsei Taryong, this improvised kind of spieling, in the style of folk song. But there are some people who do it in the style of who I've encountered who've done it in the style of mid-century pop music, like pongchak and trot kind of stuff, and some people who do it in the style of Western hymns and so on and so forth. And that willingness to take these mass cultural objects in hand and just totally screw with them, and appropriate them, and make them one's own, is one of the really striking things. I think it's one of the reasons why this subject really stands up, because there are these traditional practices like that. So Pakturi puts her name in the song. She sings about particular experiences that she's had. Mun Pilgi was a little bit more subtle. She would just swap out a phrase here or a word here. She would the song lyric would be 나서른 타양탕에 그날 밤 그 저녁아, that life in a foreign land, that young night, that young woman, and she'll sing it, that night, that young man, that 총각, So there's a tremendous amount of this flexibility in Korean singing, and thank you for bringing that up. It was something that I definitely wanted to touch on. So you can get a sense in this writing, I hope, and in the recordings that you have on the website, of that kind of that just sort of sheer inventiveness.
Okay, maybe one more question.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I have two questions. So one was, you mentioned how there were interviewers at the House of Sharing every day, but two of the women had already passed away. So although the message has gone around in South Korea, is there sort of an urgency among the women to get it out before they pass on? Or yeah. The second question was, what is their message that they want to speak out to, or in their everyday lives, do they want to sort of put it behind them? You don't want to generalize, but or are they still very keen on sort of putting out there what they have gone through?
So I guess I'll go in order. So the urgency question. I think I'm okay, actually. I do this for a living. Or do you need this for? Oh, sure. So the sense of urgency, I can sort of address both your questions at the same time, I think. The diversity of opinions about what needs to happen, about what people's relationship to their past is like, whether this person wants to forget, this person very much conceives of herself as an activist and wants to tell the story in a national and international forums, So I think that's an extremely the answers to that question are extremely diverse in terms of what people see as their relationship to the past, and so it's probably best to take a look at that True Stories of the Comfort Women to see what people say about wanting to forget or wanting to remember and to process and all these different kinds of things. The other thing is what is because there is you can go to there's a kind of central organization of the movement which is called the Korean Council for Women Drafted for Military Sexual Slavery by Japan. Very, very long name. But the website is womeninwar.net, and you can go there and it shows you all this list of demands, right? And that's a sort of composite of activists and survivors, the things that they say that they want. But my experience with survivors is that, again, they have a tremendous range of opinions about what they want in terms of in terms of the very, very practical and everyday and the very sort of transnational political issues and human rights issues and so on and so forth. So that some people are really interested in, Pakturi, for instance, was really interested in reparations, right? Pakturi was like a really super practical person, you know. She was like, you know, show me the money, you know. I've got, she had a family, you know, and she wanted to give something to her family, and that was the most important thing, you know. I mean, I can say in terms of the political struggle, that was one of the most important things for her. Bae Chunhui, who is an extremely tuned-in, political kind of person, and who speaks in the same language as oftentimes as younger people when they speak about politics. She thought that there was this reconciliation between Korea and Japan in 1965, which many people consider to be a total travesty because all of these issues had not been made public yet. So it was very difficult to give reparations to things that hadn't become public issues yet. So there's a real question as to whether, you know, that was a satisfying, you know, reconciliation. But she, anyway, you know, told me that in 1965, the Korean government had got all this money, you know. So now the Korean government has to do it. So in any case, I really don't want to represent any of these opinions as the right one or the wrong one or anything like that. I just want to pay attention to what they are, and not necessarily skip right to, you know, what activists, you know, say the goals of movements are, and to actually, you know, have some kind of contact with the people who've been most affected by this and see what they have to say. Oftentimes what they have to say is already deeply patterned by their participation in a social movement, so it's very difficult to distinguish. But in any case, my short answer to your question is it's best to let the women say these things themselves, and so I refer you to that book of testimonies and to several others. There's a book about Maria Henson, a Filipina comfort woman victim, and Jan Ruff O'Hearn, who is Dutch in Indonesia. She has a full-length volume in English of her life story, in which all of they address all of these issues. So I would refer you to those.
Were there any testimonials done by Japanese soldiers about their experiences?
Yes, there's quite a number of books of volumes of testimonies of Japanese soldiers, many of whom have come forward and been extremely explicit and denounced the system and been very helpful to the movement, actually, which was obviously a very, very difficult thing for them to do.
Sorry, I'm jumping in. That isn't just the retribution, it's just that the Japanese government has not said that it was a government plan. And so, from my understanding, many of the women, it's not necessarily a monetary retribution, they just want them to say, just as in Germany won't acknowledge the workers that were forced, they want to say, please apologize to us, whether it's the Rosas in the Philippines or in Korea, they want them to acknowledge, which may bring about money, but also the government said it was a business thing. So sorry to jump in there. That's my understanding is they really want to acknowledge before they die.
I mean, there have been always a number of different statements issued by different Japanese governmental bodies. And a lot of people think that they weren't specific enough, that they weren't written enough, that they weren't formal enough, and so on and so forth. I, you know, personally, I should say that one of the points of, and these are the kind of sticking points of the movement on behalf of the survivors of Japanese military sexual slavery. But I kind of wrote the book as a kind of way of getting around some of those sticking points. Not that they don't persist as issues, but just asking ourselves a different set of questions about how the women could be our teachers and both of music and of life and of, you know, relationships between men and women and so on, and how we could perhaps potentially have relationships with people who seem so far away from us in so many ways. How it might not be that difficult to have some kind of relationship. and in that way, to kind of come at the issue in a to come at the issue not as an issue, but as about relationships between people, and to kind of humanize the issue and then see what happens. You know, that's basically been my idea.
Just a little addition to the grandmother's songs. And my grandmother used to do the same thing. And then I think there's, in Korean emotions, there's a thing called Han. Do you understand it? So Han is all your heart feelings that you express in your own way. So it's like a storytelling or sinsetariang, all the song, folk songs, all combined. So that's very particular emotion that the Koreans have. Perhaps you have experienced.
It's interesting, you know, the word Han has a very storied history. It's not. It's obviously very. You know, this painting is called. You notice, you know, Han Sunha. You know, the sublimation of Han. That's the Han that in the title. Although I'm not sure if Kang Dok-kyung made that. Frankly, I've never had the chance to ask her if she made that title up herself. So the Han is like a term like, you know, like the blues in North America, or saudade in Brazil, or in Portugal, or it's one of these big complicated emotional clusters that has resentment in it, and it's got this in it, and it's got that in it, and it might have something to. There's a lot of different definitions of Han. It's very, very complicated. But it's interesting to me how and it's also been very politicized and socialized as a concept. You know, the concept of Han as this kind of essential Korean, you know, kind of feeling. And so again, this is another one. This is another time when I step over here and I ask, so what are the words that the women use to describe their own experiences? And some women speak about Han. Some women talk about sorum and antakaum, and there's all these different words, ways of. You know, if you want a language that's got a lot of different words for sorrow, you know, you've come to the right place, you know. But actually, you know, as somebody who went through the process of learning to speak the Korean language, you know, it's just a very satisfying thing when you finally, you know, when you learn to speak about your emotions in Korean, where you're sitting there in English, kind of going, you know, you just. But that means that I just want to be careful that, because there's Han, and then there's all these different kinds of words for different kinds of sorrow, and the singing, you know, as a kind of process of transformation. Han is never alone. It's always got hung or something else on the other side. So you sing, and you have these you know, this songs that sound almost like crying, and then they go on this sort of progression, and they get faster and they get faster, and the content gets happier and happier. Not if it doesn't get happier and happier, it gets like more and more black humor, where you're making fun of the same things that you were crying about before. And Pakturi was an absolute master of this, you know. So if there's the sorrow over here, you know, it's there because it has such an extreme, you know, joy, and, you know, on the other side, which is really one particular kind of magic of the Korean kind of emotional expressive landscape, that you have these, you know, dramatic, you know, transformations that happen, and that's, you know, extremely, you know, I think that can be extremely helpful to a lot of people to find out about that, how that happens, and how, in particular, someone like Pakturi or other people who showed up in the book, you know, take songs and use them to go on that kind of a journey. It's never finished, you know. They go right back to the beginning and keep on, start again. Yeah. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, sorry, I just have to ask. Did Korean audiences have access to your book, and if so, what was their reaction? And also, in your years in Korea, did you notice any sort of popular movements among youth to want to bridge the gap and keep this a piece of traditional culture alive and carry it on. Because when I think of it, I can only think how great it would be if troops of people actually started gathering these songs and performing them and just making them alive again.
There's a project right now, and I'm not sure what the album is going to be called, but of young women singer-songwriters who are listening to this material and are producing an album of songs. I'm not sure how many of them are going to be inspired by these songs, or how many of them are going to be versions of some of these songs. Or it's really, you know, it's really been quite a dramatic. If you were to, you know, step back in a time machine to, you know, to this movement, to what it looked like 10 years ago. Obviously, at the very beginning, you know, people were quite shocked by all these revelations, and the kind of the tenor of the social movement is very, very dark, you know, and the representations of the women are often very, very dark, and the language of victimization is extremely prevalent and strong, and so on. And over the last, you know, 10 years, you know, if you look at the website of the womeninwar.net of the Korean Council, now it's all this color, and you have survivors holding little butterflies that say, you know, peace on them, you know, and things like that. Whereas before it was very much this urgent and kind of violent, you know, movement for obvious reasons, I think. But it might not have been very, very fun for the women who are participating in it, and it's definitely softened a lot. So I think that the interest in the women is fairly, you know, I work with some other survivor groups in Korea as well, and relatively speaking, you know, within Korea, you know, there is a tremendous amount of interest, you know, in the women and their lives and so on. It peaks in, you know, on Liberation Day, and then it sort of fades, and that's something that was very frustrating to some of the women, because they feel like they really have, you know, that people care about them only once a year, you know, like people who only give money at Christmas kind of thing, you know. But in general, I think, you know, I feel quite optimistic about the trend that it's taken. I think that there's more interest now in broader international issues of sexual violence that come out of when people encounter the comfort women system. They don't necessarily think about it as an explicitly Korean issue. So it doesn't devolve into just Korea versus Japan, which is one thing that oftentimes happens in the conversation surrounding the comfort women. So that has changed, you know. People's interests are generally, I think, broadening and deepening a little bit as well. So yes, I think so. I hope so. Are we at time? Okay. Well. Oh. Oh, Fran, thank you very much. So my next research project is about Korean survivors of Hiroshima and their families. And a tremendous number of people were recruited into the Japanese military, obviously, for various things, sexual labor and forced conscription as soldiers and so on and so forth. But also a tremendous number of Koreans were mobilized as workers. And so a lot of people were taken from certain parts of Korea to work in certain parts of Japan or certain parts of the Japanese Empire. And I'm working in a small town called Hapjeon in Gyeongsang Province. Many of you may have heard of Haeinsa. Haeinsa is a very famous temple from around there, where there is a first-generation community of several thousand survivors of Hiroshima who had been taken, or whose parents, I should say, had been taken to Hiroshima to work in munitions factories. So I'm working with them and their children, who also have oftentimes have radiation-related illnesses and developmental problems and so on and so forth. And it's another project that's it's a little bit similar to this one, although it's quite a bit different because many of the people I'm working with spent their childhood in Japan. So a lot of they're deeply bilingual and went to school so it changes a bit. I'm doing more with Japanese, their extremely complicated relationship to their Japanese childhoods, which they remember very fondly, but then also as together with this extremely traumatic experience that they had there. And it's another project about these kind of amazing, older, and in this case, in the second generation case, middle-aged, Korean people and their profound resourcefulness in the face of, and cultural resourcefulness in the face of these experiences. So thank you for asking. And thank you all for coming and for all of your attention and all your wonderful questions. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you so much.
There'll also be books out in the lobby for sale, and I think if you're willing, we can get maybe your signature or something inside.
Wow,
if anybody's interested in that.
Wow,
Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah.